Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I have to say it is such a pleasure to join you today for a number of reasons. Seeing some old friends from ACEEE that I haven't seen for a while, and also the great Women in Energy breakfast discussion that we just had, which could have gone on for another hour, I think, so it's great. You know, over the last several years, my husband and I have been lurching toward retirement. I've been speaking less, I've been writing less, I've rotated off a couple of boards, spending more time with friends and family, all good. But about a year and a half ago, we kind of reversed course. And a large part of it has to do with what I'm holding in my hand. This is a special edition of a Time magazine, and a lot of it is focused on climate change. And it covers a lot of different topics, the roles of oceans, forests, and coral reefs, the lack of U.S. leadership, the role of China, complicated role of nuclear energy. It is sprinkled with ads for electric vehicles. It's grim, but it's so gratifying to see a mainstream publication like this that is focusing on climate change. But would it surprise you to learn that I bought this 22 years ago? 1997, the year that I left the Clinton administration. And so my point is, and that was 20 years after, of course, many scientists were telling us that we needed to take action. So my point is, we've known a lot for a long time, haven't we? And scientists and economists have warned us that when we delay, there will be extra costs and it will be more difficult. And so here we are, very predictably, where the only real course of action is requiring bold action. And you know, I might also add too, that it also requires and needs U.S. leadership. And I say that because sometimes we hear that the U.S. has been a leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that China is and other emerging economies are the main problem. And there's an element of truth to that, but we have to remember also that we are still the second largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And that fully a third of all CO2 in the atmosphere was made in the USA, and it will be there for decades and decades, if not hundreds of years. And then on a per capita basis, we are still twice that of China. So there's a lot to do. Well, this morning I'm going to expand a little bit on that situation analysis, but then I want to turn more focus to some personal observations of what I think may be most important and relevant over the next 5 to 10 years. So, how to briefly capture this situation? You know, we could go through some of the trends that we're reading about. The vast forest fires in the northern latitudes, from Siberia to my home state of Alaska, the European heat waves, the farmers in the Midwest having dealt with a lot of droughts and now flooding. You know, the list could go on. But I would, you know, it's a beautiful morning. I'd rather not drive us out of the room in despair. So I thought I would find some other ways to tackle that issue of size and scale. And in fact, what I talk about a lot these days is speed, scale, and synergy, or scope, because it's the best shorthand I know for describing climate change. It is accelerating, it is expanding in scale and magnitude, and it is setting off these positive feedback loops in other natural systems, some that we don't fully understand yet. Well, 3 years ago, and this is a recap, I'm sure a lot of you know this, most of the world's representatives met in Paris to sign the famous Paris Climate Agreement. And the goal for that was to limit global temperature increases above pre-industrial levels to less than 2 degrees Celsius, but to strive for 1.5 degrees. But last October, the IPCC, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued a special report in which they analyzed the global impacts between those two different temperature limits. And what they found was that every increment counts. For example, under the lower temperature limit, we could possibly, yes, is there a hearing problem?
Maybe bring the mic closer or speak more directly into the mic. It's hard to hear.
Is it hard? Is that a little better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for doing that. And so what they found, for example, with coral reefs, is that better? That we can have a good chance of saving maybe 10 to 30% of them. But under the higher temperature, we could lose them all. And so the conclusion was 2 degrees is just too dangerous. We have to do everything possible to pull out all stops to hold it to 1.5 degrees or less. And that, of course, requires much faster decarbonization. That means 45 to 50% less greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 instead of 2050. And net zero emissions by 2050 instead of the end of the century. And this is the timeline that is really the basis of all serious climate change action plans now. But to get at the scope issue, one of the best studies that does this for me is Project Great Acceleration. Have you heard of this, many of you? Maybe not. Okay. It was done a couple of years ago in which scientists mapped the trends of about 24 different phenomena. 12 were physical, like carbon and nitrogen cycles, and 12 were demographic, like population, GDP, maybe rate of fertilizer use. And you remember that hockey stick shape that we see on CO2 concentrations over the last number of decades? Well, what they found was that every one of these phenomena had the same shape. And it was that kind of finding that led scientists to adopt the formal name of Anthropocene, age of man, to describe when humans started driving the Earth's natural systems far beyond the variation that you see in history. And of particular relevance to us today is that the triggering event of that great acceleration was all about energy use. It was when man became dependent on fossil fuels. And so by 1900, about 3/4 of energy use was based on coal and oil. And of course that brought many, many benefits, economic benefits, raising the standard of living for so many hundreds of millions of people. But it also set off chain reactions in the natural systems and ecosystems that provide the basis for life. And I have to stress, very little of that captured in our economic framework and valued in it. And so by 1950, without any of those checks, that's when we started seeing that same kind of curve for all of those variables. So it's, it's no wonder that we're talking about reinventing our energy system. Not tweaking around the edges, but reinventing it. Reinventing fire, as Avery Lovins would say, and perhaps said yesterday. And how we respond, and what I wanted to emphasize, it not only affects climate change, as if that weren't enough, but then it affects all of these other, and most of these other trends, both physical and human. But this group, of course, understands that energy efficiency is also at the heart of these plans. And in the United States, for example, we know that energy efficiency has meant more demand than any fuel, more than coal, more than oil, more than gas, more than a couple of them combined. And we know it also offers a stream of benefits that many other fuels, most other fuels don't, including enhanced health and comfort. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Globally, the International Energy Agency, IEA, I'm sure you're familiar with it, has reported in their last 2019 report on efficiency that efficiency has prevented 12% of global demand just since 2000. And that it has offset many of the emissions from the emerging economies, at least until 2017. But they also report that a lot of cost-effective efficiency is still being left on the table. They say, for example, that nearly 70% of all energy use falls under no codes or standards. A pretty sobering fact that then also opens the room for a lot of opportunity. That industry can double the value of its energy use. That 70% of the potential is in light energy through efficient motors and electric heat pumps for process heating. And finally, in IEA's sustainable development scenario, we could hold global demand in 2040 to today's level, just using cost-effective energy efficiency. Of course, IEA has, shall we say, a legacy of being rather conservative with clean energy trends, so I suspect the potential is even much greater than that. Well, we sometimes get asked, and I wonder if Amory dealt with this yesterday, if efficiency is so compelling, then why does it get the same attention of, say, solar and wind? And, you know, the response is pretty obvious. Solar and wind are tangible, and they are very photogenic demonstrations of what you're doing, right? And energy efficiency is inherently invisible. It's the absence of something. One of my favorite congressmen that I used to work with was Republican Vern Ehlers from Michigan, a physicist and a great champion of energy efficiency. And he told me once, Christine, if energy were only purple, we'd save a lot more. Well, maybe times are changing actually, because if the absence of sound from a Tesla is getting a lot of attention, then maybe efficiency is going to become more tinged with purple as we realize what a role it plays with this climate change challenge. The bottom line for me then is that what we need most over the next 5 to 10 years is really a laser focus on designing strategies and policies and programs that mimic the very challenges that we're trying to face in terms of speed, scale, and systemic approaches. Speed not only because of cost and difficulty, but because it may be life-threatening not to. And scale because it isn't really transformation without scale, is it? You know, one-offs we don't have time for anymore, even interesting case studies that don't have the potential to add up to a lot more. And then systemic, because integrated approaches are often powerful and cost-effective ways to address multiple things at once. So this week, you're covering dozens of topics, of course, that are relating specifically to industry and energy efficiency. I'm going to focus on several broader trends that affect industry, but also other sectors as well. The first one is actually leveraging the limits that we're facing, the urgency. Einstein, as usual, put it so well, once we know our limits, we can go beyond them. And there's so many interesting cases of this. I visited Singapore a few years ago and came to learn why they're always in one of the top global innovation hotspots. And it came largely, they explained, because when that small state became independent in 1965, it really didn't have much choice. They had very few resources. In fact, they were importing virtually all of its water from Malaysia, not a sustainable situation. So that urgency, that need, and plus steady leadership over any number of years created a culture of innovation that we turn to for many, many things, but including green technologies and practices. Speaking of that, one of my favorite green buildings is actually just a couple miles from here. It's a 14-story medical complex that earned LEED Platinum certification for hospitals 12 years ago, the first one in the country. And it's a beautiful building. It's filled with daylight and windows. It uses radiant heat. It uses chilled beams for air conditioning. It treats all of its wastewater on site. Its water use, potable water use, is 60% less than a benchmark. But all of it was made possible because of the goal they set. It was the owner and the design team that said, we want 60% less energy use in this building than Oregon Code, which is pretty rigid, and for 20% less cost. And they used that criteria to recruit the engineering team. It's just another example that Amory and others point to about the power of stretch goals and integrated approaches that can give you so much more. Maybe you've heard of the Living Building Challenge. It's a stretch green building program that is based all around prerequisites that are stringent. In energy, for example, a building must demonstrate that it meets all 105% of its energy needs through on-site renewable energy plus some storage. And of course, to do that, they need deep energy efficiency. The Bullitt Center is a certified building like that, and it's fabulous in Seattle. More broadly, tapping the power of limits is one of the key principles of that field called biomimicry, the burgeoning field of biomimicry. Whereas they say you can turn to nature for 3 billion years of experimentation for inspiration, like paint that cleans itself, as inspired by the lotus flower. If you want to explore that a little further, I encourage you to go to their website, Ask Nature, and put in parameters of what you're looking for. And you'll get some really good research. So So design around limits is really a pervasive concept. We use it in engineering modeling, in economic modeling. We use it in our lives. If we could live forever, would we live differently? I suspect. If I had unlimited income, would I spend it differently? That would be a yes. But now we are just in the very early stages of grappling with carbon limits. So there's so much more that we can do. And the silver lining of this emergency that we're facing now is we're having much bolder discussions than we've had in the past, and that we rarely have in this country. And we're beginning to grasp, too, that there are many benefits that come from that kind of bold thinking. Okay, the second lever at our disposal beyond exploiting the urgency and the limits is the power of markets. You know, we talk a lot about markets in this country. We're very proud of our free market system. And not long ago on the Senate floor, we heard a number of senators lambasting what they thought was their interpretation of the Green New Deal. And the thing that we often heard was the private sector can innovate our way out of this if we do believe in climate change, of course. Well, that does, and I have to apologize, it does remind me of the classic light bulb jokes, economist jokes. How many economists does it take to change a light bulb? None. If government would just get out of the way, it would screw itself in. Or another version, and there are many out there if you just look them up. Not needed. If it were profitable, it would have been screwed in. But markets, and we sometimes forget this when we have this discussion, are creations of society. It is precisely government's role to set the parameters of how the market operates in accordance with broad social goals, and to try to assure that there are fairly complete price and information signals that guide the choices that leads to private sector innovation that we very much need. And we've scarcely begun to exploit the power of those markets on behalf of energy, certainly, and clearly climate change. In fact, we can view climate change as kind of the mother of all market failures. So let me go through just a few ways in which we can actually start using the levers of the market. And the one, of course, it would be nice if we could stop subsidies that are encouraging the production of carbon. In this country, it's about $30 billion worth of direct pre-tax subsidies. And around the world, it's about $500 billion. And we know that a number of countries use these to help lower the cost to certain communities. And that can be very controversial if they don't lower the cost. But there are other instruments that are available to help those communities rather than distorting the price of the markets. So beyond, and besides, another thing is, it would, when you consider the full social cost that is included in that subsidy, it becomes pretty compelling. In fact, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, IMF, released a working paper just a couple of months ago that did just that, added it up, and it came to $5.2 trillion, equivalent to 6.5% of world GDP. And they found that if the full price of energy were included in prices going back to 2015, that our greenhouse gas emissions could be 26% lower. So this is not a trivial thing we're talking about in underpricing energy. So after we remove subsidies, then we can put a price on carbon. There's a concept. And why? To send a signal through all the nooks and crannies of our vast economic and financial framework that are very hard to get at otherwise. And we know that besides that, it helps direct investment, it helps provide certainty for direct investment, and it supports other complementary policies like efficiency standards. The two can go hand in hand. We know also that carbon prices are less effective in areas like transportation, where you can have pretty hefty taxes that may not change behavior. But the industrial sector is one that is called out by many parties as being especially amenable to it because it is more price sensitive. And I think that makes sense too, because many times your efficiency investments are competing against other company projects. based on return on investment. So if you included a price of carbon in that, it might change the priorities. And that's precisely why over 1,400 companies today are not waiting for government, but instituting their own internal carbon price to help guide their allocations and to also position themselves then for a carbon-constrained world. Well, today, 46 countries and 28 subnationals do put a price on carbon, either through cap and trade limits or through a direct tax. But altogether, they add up to just 15% of emissions. So there's a long way to go. And many of them have the price so low that it's not terribly effective. But even at the lower level, you can get results. For example, Great Britain attributes utilities exiting the coal industry faster than it would otherwise through its tax system. And in British Columbia, they had a low, they still have, they've increased it recently. There was a lot of worry that it would chill the economy, but they kept their emissions down to 1-2% in spite of economic growth for that period of time of 19 and 20%. So it did not harm economic growth. Well, today we actually have several proposals for carbon taxes in Congress, and all designed to ratchet up gradually over time, which is good, and with various ways of using the revenue that would come from it. It's hard to imagine any of them moving anytime soon because of politics and because of Senate leadership. But as more and more jurisdictions and companies start adding their own prices, more and more companies may want to see harmonization and may want the certainty that comes from that. So if you believe in the power of markets, it's hard to deny a price for carbon. Which is why, of course, thousands of economists and former Federal Reserve chairmen and Nobel laureates strongly recommend that. The third market-based tool, quickly, is just disclosure of risks. Investors want to know what they're investing in. And there are lots of acronyms that are working in this area, SSI, GRI, CDP, lots of them. But an article that I would call your attention to in Foreign Policy caught my eye a couple months ago, because a historian who wrote about the 2008 market crash has just written an article saying that our Federal Reserve definitely has a responsibility and an opportunity to encourage risk disclosure associated with climate change. And in fact, encouraging investment in infrastructure is climate related. Why? To help protect our financial system from climate related shocks. Interesting to see. And finally, I do want to stress that government programs and markets do work in complementary and should. California's long-standing building code, for example, as I recall, is ratcheted up every 3 years based on evolving technology and changing market conditions. It's one of the major reasons why California has kept its per capita electricity constant over all these decades. And in the course of doing that, it provides direction and certainty for the building industry. I have to say, it is, just for that reason, it's unsettling to see the uncertainty that this administration is putting in rulemakings right now that have caused the U.S. to be a leader in greenhouse gas emissions. I'm talking about the vehicle fuel efficiency standards, the national appliance standards, lighting standards. All of these have been so powerful and cost effective. And this is, I'll never forget, it was the GE CEO that was speaking to Congress years ago when we were dealing with the on-again, off-again tax credit for renewable energy. And he said, nothing chills private investment more than uncertainty. So this is a time where we should be supporting that kind of certainty and those proven cost-effective programs. Well, the last lever at our disposal that I would suggest is innovation with a capital I. And it's an overused word, so I understand, but I'm going to overuse it again. And let me back up by saying this. This may shock you, but you don't find bipartisan agreement on too many things these days. And so when we see it, we should welcome it and celebrate it. And so that brought to mind the House Appropriation Markup language 2 years ago. This for the Office of Energy Efficiency of Renewable Energy. This was in response to the president's budget proposal to cut those budgets by 69%, and including wiping out the wildly successful ARPA-E research program, one of my favorite programs in all of the federal government. The next year, the administration also proposed an even higher decrease, 71%. So that appropriation language, Congress came back and not only restored virtually all of the funding, but provided a net increase overall from the prior years. And their markup language spoke so eloquently of how these programs are critical to our nation's competitiveness in this burgeoning clean energy market that China is certainly playing in, and that we must continue our leadership in R&D and innovation, and that these programs are helping create and sustain millions and millions of good jobs, including energy efficiency. It was a beautiful thing to see. It nearly brought tears to my eyes. But I have to say, the president's budget for 2020 is an 85% cut. I suspect that Congress will turn that around again, but there's still lots of opportunity costs from just doing that. So when we think about innovation, clearly hard technology is key to this reinventing, and that includes longer-term breakthrough technologies for things like carbon capture. But deployment of existing technology, I think, is going to be even more critical in the next 5 to 10 years, so that we can quickly bend down that emission curve and change the trajectory. And along with that is the priority on soft technology, the human dimension that can make a difference between a technology sweeping the market or staying in a niche. And I'm talking about everything from carbon pricing to financial instruments to clever marketing and communications. So I thought I would review just several ways that some other groups are focusing on priorities that were inspiring to me and maybe to you. One comes from the group at Energy Innovation, Help Harvey and his team, and they present a very clear triage strategy that focuses on policy. And it runs something like this. Focusing on electricity because that is the easiest area to decarbonize. First, focus on the 20 countries that produce 75% of emissions. Next, redirect investment dollars, decisions that are made on a daily basis, from carbon-based energy and infrastructure projects that will determine consumption for many decades to come. And then next, among the hundreds of policies out there, focus on the 10 most tried and true, the ones with the largest impact, starting with carbon prices, and then going through. I can read all 9 of them. Why don't I do that? Second, industry efficiency standards, various land use related measures, power sector policies, industrial process emissions, renewable energy portfolio standards, building codes and appliance standards, fuel economy standards, urban design for mobility, electrifying vehicles, and fee rebates. Those get the biggest bang for the buck and can be put in place very powerfully. And here again, of course, efficiency shines. Another perspective comes from inventor Saul Griffith. And this is an intriguing perspective. He's been exploring the complete decarbonization goal that's laid out in the Green New Deal resolution. Saul developed an updated net energy flow map for the United States. And he did that under contract for ARPA-E. You've seen them before, Zansky diagrams that show the life cycle of energy, essentially from extraction all the way to end uses and embodied. But this version, if you've seen it, is down to a level of granularity we've never seen, down to 1/10 of 1% of our 100 gigatons in this energy use. And so from that, he makes a couple of observations. One, and we knew this, 50% of our energy is wasted from the first stage to the end use. And second of all, most of that waste does come from fossil fuels. And so what Saul is saying is that whereas most analyses say electricity is just 27% of the total energy picture, but if we quickly tried to electrify more of the economy, by removing that waste, we would inherently reduce demand by 50%. and therefore greatly reduce the supply challenge that you're trying to deal with. Well, technically, the 2030 challenge would be a lot easier practically, and politically, tougher to say. Probably depends on how much we're willing to incent utilities or car manufacturers, for example, to move more quickly towards electrification. And then the last roadmap I'll refer to is Project Drawdown. Paul Hawkins' group, many of you are familiar with that. Really interesting take in looking at a very broad list of strategies that are cost-effective, tried and true, at one scale or another for reducing emissions and actually drawing them down out of the atmosphere. And efficiency is certainly in there, represented well, but they also get into things like changing food habits. It's in the top 10, and cutting food waste, in fact. But the single most intriguing one for me is that when you provide equal educational opportunities and family planning to women who need it, that becomes the single most cost-effective tool in dealing with climate change. And why? Because these women have smaller, more educated families, and so do their kids. So it's a powerful impact on natural resources. So as we settle on priorities over the next decade, we may find it useful, should find it useful to recalibrate some of our own actions. I'll go through a few of these. Perhaps suspending otherwise worthwhile efforts that are great in and of themselves, but may not have the speed, scale, and synergy that we need at this moment in time. Striving for more consensus and compromise than we're used to. Engaging a more diverse set of stakeholders than we're used to. And certainly the attention being paid to social justice and helping communities, for example, that have lost coal mines. These are steps in the right direction, I think. It certainly means getting more women in the energy field, as we discussed this morning, and women in high-level positions as well, on boards and an executive suite. On an interpersonal level, I think it does mean learning how to talk about climate change, and even around the family dinner table. I speak from experience. Do you know Myers-Briggs? I'm an INTJ. So I assumed that presenting data and facts would be persuasive. Wrong. I've learned the hard way from the science of communicating climate change. Then asking questions and listening may be good. Changing terminology. Frank Lutz is a Republican strategist who now regrets providing very useful information used to undermine the credibility of climate science. He's now a convert, and he's offering help in changing the terminology, or at least recommendations. For example, he says, use cleaner, safer, healthier over sustainable. Emphasizing careers and career paths as more meaningful than jobs. I thought it was interesting in a testimony, he pointed to the senators and said, do you have a job, Senator, or a career? I said, you take my point. I'd also encourage more company leaders to speak out and get involved in the messy world of politics, and I'm not talking about lobbying arms. I recall recently a wonderful interview with the CEO of a major utility that has set some very aggressive clean energy goals for 2030 and 2050. It was a wonderful conversation. But when he was asked, did you voice your concern about withdrawing from the Paris Agreement? He said, no, I don't like to get involved with political things like that. And I think that time has passed. I think elected officials need to hear from company leadership on what you need the most to thrive in this changing environment. Well, I've covered a lot of ground this morning. And sometimes the best way to put our lives and our times in perspective is to see the Earth as few others have, literally from outer space. And I've long been drawn to how astronauts and people on flight missions have responded. They're often trained as physicists or engineers, and they turn into downright poets once they leave the gravity of Earth. Several were shocked at how thin and fragile our atmosphere seemed. He said, when you're on Earth, the sky seems endless. It goes on forever, but not in space. Listen to the poetry of Lauren Acton, who was on the space shuttle. He said, looking outward to the blackness of space, sprinkled with the glory of a universe of lights, I saw majesty, but no welcome. Below was a welcoming planet, there contained in the thin, moving, incredibly fragile shell of the biosphere is everything that you hold dear to you. That's where life is. Or this from the early Apollo 8 mission that circled the moon. And at one point on this, as they were headed to outer space, one of the crew holding the camera just turned the camera around casually and pointed it back to where they're coming from. And he said this, it was quite a shock. The focus has been the moon, the stars, the planets, and suddenly we look back at ourselves. We went to discover the moon, but our new self-awareness may well have turned out to be the most important reason we met. In fact, it was a later photo where it became the famous blue marble image that helped contribute to this ushering in of new environmental awareness in the 60s and 70s. Tipping points can happen sometimes very quickly when there is a critical mass of people moving in the same direction. And I think we may be at the cusp of that kind of sea change for climate change. And I think it's not only because we better understand the urgency of what we need to do, but also beginning to understand all the benefits that can come from things like modernizing our grid and our infrastructure, providing more health and quality, not only for us, but for people around the world, which also enhances our own national security. There's a lot of upside to taking this on. Perhaps most of all, what we leave our children. And it must be gratifying to know that your industry is going to play such an important role. Thank you.